We are looking at a particular topic that's coming to an end next Sunday, and that's understanding our culture. What is our culture all about, so that we may be able to target the gospel. The content does not change, but the way we share it may change depending upon what the culture is like. So today we're going to look at tribalism. It's a very interesting concept. So we started off by saying that individualism is the core aspect of what American culture, secular culture, is all about, and increasingly more so within Christianity as well. And so if we define individualism, this is a fundamental lie of modernity, that we own ourselves, that we belong to us ultimately, and that we are responsible for creating the meaning and identity satisfaction within our own lives. That's a lot of responsibility for us, but that's individualism. And what we're doing is we've been studying what this means, and that it creates a number of different sub-themes: authenticity, be true to yourself, freedom, consumerism, the therapeutic culture. But today we want to look at tribalism as a topic that arises out of individualism. So I have 3 points, and the lecture part is only 30 minutes long, and then we can dialogue and discuss. But I have 3 points. The movements of our past has resulted in a culture that magnifies victimhood. So a number of these things, I've gone and did surveyed a little bit. It's a repeat, so because not everyone is here every Sunday. So we started off with Rousseau, right? So he may be the fountainhead, the beginning point for the Romantics, and he wrote a book called The Confessions, where he wants to understand human nature by going inward within himself to see what the desires, what the longings are. And he writes this story of stealing the asparagus, where a friend wanted him to help him, Rousseau, to steal asparagus from his own mother, so that he can go out and sell it and get some money, some change or pocket change. And he says that he went and he helped his friend to steal because there was a good desire. You want to help a friend when they ask you, a friend that is in need. So the inner desire is positive. But what happened was the social constraint of the relationship placed peer pressure upon him, so that what was a good desire was transformed into an evil desire. In other words, in of himself, his inner world is good and righteous. But when social institutions get in the way, it twists that goodness to things that are evil. In other words, we are born good. It's society that makes us evil. This is Rousseau's thesis, which is part of how the culture of victimhood arose. Because if we're living in a culture of victimhood, then what is causing us to be victims? What's the source of oppression? And for Rousseau, and in our culture to some degree, society is to some degree responsible for my life situation. If I'm naturally good and social institutions transform my inner goodness to that which is unacceptable, wicked, evil, then to some degree, my life situation, I can blame it upon society. So keep that one in mind. The second thing we want to do is Freud comes along and he sexualizes the human person. So whether you agree with Freud's total psychotherapeutic structure or not, he introduces sexuality to the human person so that it becomes very difficult to understand the human person without the category of sexuality. And he argues that civilized man has exchanged a portion of the possibilities of happiness for a portion of society. In other words, what he's saying is that there are sexual instincts that we have which we do not give free expression to, but we hold it and restrain it in order that we may be part of a society that gives us certain benefits, security, let's say, companionship. And so, yeah, you guys are pretty familiar with this from Intro to Psychology way back when, but you got the id, which is a collection of your instincts, your desires. I want to do that now. And then the superego is that moral code that's been impressed upon us that guides us in what to do and not to do in a civilized context. And the ego is always compromising between the two so that we can give some expression, some gratification, without losing our place within society, which means that for Freud, society or civilization is always constraining the free expression of who we are. So the similar theme with Rousseau, so that social institutions are impressed upon our superego, and it is part of that mind that always checks us, delayed gratification or the experiencing of our instincts through other socially acceptable means. But social institutions are what keeps us from fully actualizing our inner self. And our sexual component would be huge, and thus one of the major reasons why sexuality is so politicized today within our culture. So that the victimhood culture is compounded by Rousseau and Freud. And then here's the trump card. It's the tragedy of the Holocaust. We're looking at almost 70 years, 65 years, and the impact of it is being lost, I guess, as we experience distance from that event. But this has been a tremendous tragedy within our culture and in our mindset. 17 million victims. It's not usually we focus on the Jewish population, 6 million, but there were a number of different people who had died or were oppressed during that regime. So the Holocaust has had a devastating effect upon the Western mind. So my mentor at Moody, he used to say all theology has to be done under the shadow of the Holocaust because it had such a casted such long shadow, its impact, so that it's never again to remember the Holocaust. And it was because of the Holocaust that the whole UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was established. So that what happens is if you compound the three, victimhood and status are linked. So that if you want a voice within our culture, somewhere along the line, it's helpful if you are able to articulate how you have been victimized, because victims are heard. To such a degree that there's an anti-victimhood culture emerging now. And there are two sides, and they're pretty well separated out, segregated. So victimhood, get out of responsibility free. So that there are true victims, and then there are those who use victims to get their own way. So the victimhood is all about power, so that you have been oppressed, and that oppression is used as a means to gain power. We see it in a number of different cultures. I think this is, I forgot his name, Nathan Couch, is it? He was a driver with the 4 teenagers in the car. He was drunk. They stole beer from a Walmart. He crashed into a tree, and I think 4 of his passengers died. And during the trial, he argued that he suffered from affluenza. So that it was wealth and the side effects of wealth where he became the kind of person he did that made that kind of decision. He's playing the victim card. Because if you're a victim, you are heard more than if not. Or are white men the real victims? And I hear this in different contexts, right? So that you have all these different sub-minorities, and suddenly being white, wow, that's not the best way to perhaps get a job where in a culture diversity is emphasized. White lives matter just like black lives matter. So there's a reactionary movement back and forth that's creating quite a bit of the separation within our culture. And what's occurring is there are true victims. Of course there are victims within our culture experiencing oppression. But at the same time, every person is responsible. Balancing these two things and how you balance it is creating these subsections or tribes. It's creating tribes within our culture of isolated people groups. And the sense of unity is dissipating quite quickly within our culture. In fact, I read this book about 20 years ago. It's interesting when I read it as an inspirational book. You know, these are three individuals, I think two doctors, medical, and one dentist, who grew up out of the hoods, and they worked together so that they encourage each other to make a life for themselves. And it was interesting because these guys are used as, look, you can do it too, right? If you're responsible enough. I know the inner city school system is not the very best, but look at these guys. You can do it if you really want. But on this side, if it's that easy, why are we making them a hero? It's because it's that hard. It's like running against the wind or biking uphill. And so both sides use the story in order to strengthen their particular position. Second point, if institutions are oppressive, then those who experience similar forms of oppression form communal groups. Those who experience same type of oppression from institutions form these communal groups, or what we're calling tribes. So that tribalism, groupings according to shared oppression. Doesn't have to be now ethnicity unless it's the same experience of victimization, but it's the shared way in which we have been victimized that creates these groupings. So that the dangers of tribalism is that you create these circles of groups of uniformity. The criteria for the group is how did you experience suffering from another, from institutions. And it's creating these divides within our world. So that this is Robin Wright. It says, look, in Georgia, I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are all different, like Kurds, Quebec, all of these Kazakhstan ethnic groups, Scots in Britain. And he's talking about all the places where people groups that are living under a larger national umbrella are trying to create their own selfhood or state. And what he says is they starkly illustrates how of all features of the post-Cold War World War, the most consistently troubling are turning out to be the tribal hatreds that divide humanity by faith, race, faith, and nationality. The explosion of communal violence is the paramount issue facing the human rights movement today, and containing the abuses committed in the name of ethnic or religious groups, tribal groups, will be our foremost challenge for the years to come. I think he's right. The number one threat to our society or on a national level is our inability to get these tribal groups to be able to dialogue in such a way they respect each other, let alone come to some type of compromise and agreement. The isolation between the tribes is growing deeper and deeper. So the threat of tribalism, so this one is interesting. It's from New Atlanta. It says, look, in the very beginning, it's not that we're more diverse today. In many ways, we're very diverse. We're multi-ethnic way back then. In the beginning, you had English, Scots, French, Swedes, Greeks, and others. They tended to identify far more strongly as Virginians and New Yorkers, your state identity more than your national, complicating any effort to bind a new nation together with common beliefs. Early America was also an unprecedented amalgam of religious denominations, including a variety of dissenters who have been home from the old world homes. The Constitution managed to overcome these divisions. It's no longer the same today. Why? What's the difference between the diversity of the past and the diversity of the present? The victim of culture that's arisen from Rousseau and Freud has created the sense of tribalism. And then secondly, the definition for tolerance, which we dropped off 2 studies ago, that this is D.A. Carson, that the definition of tolerance has changed. Before, tolerance is accepting the existence of different views. So that if you differ from me, I accept the fact that you can have a different view. Carson argues that the language of difference has moved from accepting the existence of to accepting the different view itself. If you don't accept my view, then you are not accepting me and you are being intolerant. There's a word of difference between these 2 definitions. So that Carson says the shift from accepting the existence of different views to the acceptance of different views from recognizing other people's rights to have different beliefs and practices to accepting the different views of other people, is subtle in form, but massive in substance. It's very hard to say to an LGBT member, I disagree with your position, but I accept you as a person. Those categories don't really translate in today's culture because of this definition of tolerance that has shifted. And the third is technology. That's the major difference. Amplified tribalism. You can go on Facebook, you can go on Twitter, any of our social media accounts, and find a group that is oppressed just like you have been. And then you can create the communities, and then within those communities, the belief system is isolated out and amplified because everyone thinks just like you in those groups. So take the LGBTQ plus community. It's an interesting community. At one point, you would ask, what unites them as one community? And the interesting thing is, and this is Carl Trueman says, when you look at each of those initials, the only thing that unites them as a broad movement is that they have been sexually oppressed. In other words, they are a tribe because they experience similar type of oppression. In fact, Trueman says, look, the first and perhaps the most obvious matter to discuss is the odd nature of the LGBTQ plus alliance. So familiar has this acronym become that it is possible to miss completely the fact that it is far from an obvious or natural confederation of sexual minorities. This is perhaps most evident in the matter of the T and Q, as both transgenderism and queer theory are predicated on a basic denial of the fixed nature of the gender. There's fluidity. But on the flip side, the lesbian and gay category seems to assume a more stable gender. So that what he argues is the reason why they're together is because of similarity of oppression that they have experienced. What's interesting is, this is Border Bookstore. It no longer exists. Border's died out. But this is Border on Michigan Avenue. It's their flagship. And when I was teaching at Moody during breaks, I would take these walks and I would go to Border Bookstore and I would look at the top 20 bestsellers. There's one way of keeping in mind what's our culture reading and what's in the mind front. When I first started teaching, I walked through, and then toward the late 1990s, I started to notice these special studies sections. I don't know, you may have seen it. There are Black studies, there's Latin studies, Asian studies, gay studies, and the numbers just increase. And what's interesting is what's occurring is that these minority groups that have been oppressed are now trying to reassert their voice. And we're living in a culture where we're trying to give them that voice through different sections. This is a history book, pretty popular in certain communities. A People's History of the United States, where, just the lighter part, it is the only volume to tell American story from the point of view of those who didn't have a chance to tell their history. Women, Native Americans, working poor, immigrant laborers. Because now we want, if their voices have been oppressed, now we're trying to give these tribal groups a venue by which they can articulate their voicing. And the counter. So once again, it's the pushback, back and forth. And this is the story of Florida, which is a very interesting case. But in Florida, the attempt to, how do I put it? The attempt to quiet some of the minority voices that may be too loud. Was that politically correct enough? Okay. So, and so the whole AP course on African-American history is very interesting. This is Harvard. Harvard, all the major institutions are experiencing this. And so Trueman says, look, when he looked through the Harvard history course for history courses, there was no course on Reformation or Renaissance, not one course. But there were classes for Asian American studies, Native American history, and British colonial violence. Saying, wait a minute. Yeah, perhaps there should be courses here. It's not arguing that. But the Reformation and Renaissance are huge, historically significant, almost, was it earthquakes? How do you say earthquakes? Seismic?
Seismic.
Seismic, thank you. Seismic level. I'm just keep going, right? Happens in the pulpit. I know I'm mispronouncing things, and I hear this voice that's saying, just keep talking, just keep talking. So, and he's saying, look, there's none of those courses there. And then he found one course devoted to early modern history from 1450 to 1789. He's saying, how much of 350 years can you study, or 340 years can you study in a 15-week course? And then what he found was Feminism and Pornography, 1975 to 1995, a 20-year period. Now, he's not arguing that this course should not be taught. What he is saying is perhaps there's a misbalance here in giving voice to certain tribes, whereby fundamental moments of history are not being dealt with as they ought to. Last point. Where are we going to go from this in terms of victimhood? Drive the dialogue into the root of the issue, not victimhood, but dignity. The last thing I would want to do is argue with someone on their victimhood status. You will not win in this culture, and I don't think that's the best way to share the gospel anyway. I would go one step further and go to the level of dignity, and this is pretty short. So this is, I can't even pronounce it, Yoga Carter principles, and it's the application of the International Human Rights, the UDHR, to the sexually oppressed community. I didn't know this existed until about 2 weeks ago, but and sexuality and sexual rights was not huge in the original document, so it's sort of a addendum. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. All human rights are universal, interdependent, indivisible, and interrelated. Sexual orientation and gender identity are integral to every person's dignity and humanity and must not be the basis for discrimination or abuse. So that this aspect, the victimization, one can call it out as being unjust because of this fundamental principle. You don't want to fight the battle here. You want to fight the battle here. And in fact, in a lot of instances, the oppression that they point to are genuine. But you want to fight the battle here. Because where this is coming from is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1947, which was formed. This is Franklin Roosevelt's wife. She was the head of the committee. There were 18 nations, and they created a 5-person subcommittee to write this out, the basic rights of humanity, and it was based upon the dignity of the human being. And the major proponent was Jack Martin, Martin, who was a Catholic French philosopher who built it upon the Christian doctrine of the image of God language. So that God said, let us make man in our own image, and then he has dominion over the fish in the sea, and that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created a male and female. This image language is the fundamental basis. For the worldview, it's the fundamental basis by which human beings are dignified. And if they are dignified, they have certain inalienable rights, of which now we articulate. So that in each of those claims to victimhood, they're saying their rights are violated, those rights that are based upon their dignity. But unless you affirm a Christian or Judeo-Christian theology, you do not have the image language to ground the dignity of the human person. That's where, at least for me, the battle ought to have or be fought. In other words, remember this slide from a couple Sundays ago that way in the beginning, that the human order arises from divine order. It's God who provides the order and pattern of this world. But along the way, if God disappears, where does order come from? And the answer in our culture is that we, individual, when we look inside, we take the order and pattern within us and we project it out into our world. And the question is, how do you share the gospel in this culture? And we're going to explore that more in the weeks to come in Sunday school, not in this particular, so this series ends today as we looked at our culture. Now the question is, how do you share the gospel in this culture so that you're true to the gospel and yet at the same time, you respect where they're coming from in terms of their life story. Okay, I felt like I talked a lot. Oh, boy, sorry. And I'm afraid to ask, are there any thoughts or questions on this? So I'll smile and laugh, and if there are any thoughts or questions, it's great. You are free to share. Why is it so cold? Yeah. Don't point to me. Yeah, point up. There's some tough topics here. I'm assuming that not everybody would agree, even in this room, let alone in our culture, and that's the source of quite a division within our society and our churches. This is not just a cultural issue, this is a church issue. Yes.
So I think just thinking about gospel, when we are trying to just recruiting more people, because it again is a coexist principle as like here. Like tolerance, as you mentioned, is the key point. Like where is the tolerance? So when you say tolerance, okay, when you are facing another person believing another belief, what is your stand? Basically, should you just accept it and then in a separate way, or should you just try to change him, or just try to make him into our group? Mm-hmm. So I think that's
that is a huge one. Yeah. That is a huge one, and open the discussion here as well.
I don't think you can change a person necessarily. I would think for that person.
Grateful.
Bring them to the environment where they can possibly, change their minds and all that.
You still want to change, but just not in the active way.
Right.
Okay.
I think we cannot change a person, but God can. That's my experience.
So praying, leading to God, but don't tell them in the beginning, we're going to change you later on, sort of like I didn't finish my statement. Sort of like marriage. I accept you now, but give me 20 years. Oh, I should have stopped while I was ahead. I should have stopped. But see, what you're raising is a huge issue. Because there are sections of Christianity where, unless they're open to change, the gospel is not applicable to them. I have talked with professors at Moody who say you cannot be gay and a Christian. As soon as you are gay, you are not a Christian. You have gone against one of the fundamental beliefs of Christianity, and the fact that you have same-sex attraction shows that you have not been regenerated at heart. For that individual, you better be willing to change or you're not saved. And that's Moody and a number of seminaries and churches that believe that. And on one level, it's not really my concern what they do as much as what's going to go on in here. And can we, within a level of disagreement, hold the same purpose as a church? And that's the challenge for us. And I think, in my opinion, perhaps the greatest challenge to our community. I don't know how many people here have said in the last 3-4 months, well, we have great community. We have great community, right? Right? We do, right? I mean, let the people come. We'll show them how nice we are. And my point is, we'll show you how nice we are once we learn to respect those who are different from us within our own community. That's going to be a challenge. Any other thoughts? Yes, Andrew.
So, tribalism on the right, and I'm sure it bothers all of us. I'm sure it bothers all of us.
Well,
the vibe and all.
I'm not going to nod to that. I heard you, yeah.
And okay. I think so. In one of the slides you mentioned, there's this freaking human pattern, right? I think it's more than that. Right? There's giving in to a sense of outrage and goodness. a sense of.
I'm sorry, the air conditioning is.
Outrage and grievance. Giving
Okay,
into that,
right, okay.
giving into that temptation, I think is contributing a lot to it. Social media, you mentioned social media, right? The internet has made it easier to get these things. So we ought to caution ourselves, right? That we don't give into this temptation. This feeling of outrage and grievance. It comes from both sides, right? And you can say, oh, he started to trace it. This analogy I use with my son is I say a pendulum kind of swings both ways, right? You can swing too far one way or the other. You get it back. So you swing too far to the left, what happens? There's pushback. And the pushback, I think, is bad. Where it goes wrong is when we give in to this outrage and grievance, when we consume too much social media, right? Like if at work, say I'm constantly annoyed, I'm thinking of a certain coworker. It's kind of annoying. How's too much, right? But that's a sin in itself. That I think that I get constantly annoyed with her. Where you get into that and you get it go too far, that's where it becomes a sin. It doesn't grow to the point of outrage and grievance against her, it's just annoyance. And I think one of the things, but if I had colleagues around me who I'm sure are all annoyed by this also, if we all got together and then start gossiping about her and things like that, right? Now it starts comes into bullying, and we're giving in to this satisfaction of complaining about this one person. And that's where we come, it goes too far. In the Bible, there are certain principles that we taught, but nowhere does it say, I don't think anywhere, where it says, oh, you got to, give into your outrage and your grievance. So I think that's a big, that's what's poisoning right now, is that we're giving into this temptation. It feels kind of good. It feels kind of good to be with other, they say it's echo chamber thing. It feels good. Consuming too much of that is poison. I guess what I'm saying is obvious to all of us. It's obvious. Yeah. But
Let's see if there's interaction dialogue
okay,
together.
it's
Yeah.
obvious, maybe, people may want to say something else about it.
Are there comments or thoughts before moving to a new topic on what Andrew has shared?
Okay, no, well, I have a different thought.
Oh, yeah, wait on this. See if there's any follow-up. Yeah.
I feel agree with that. That's all I have.
So she's not the one that talks a lot, right?
I was going to hold my comment, but I guess I would say I'm still not sure what's wrong with practice. I mean, if it's just finding people you're comfortable with, or taking a women's studies class because you're more interested in that than the Renaissance, what's wrong with it? It's really what Andrew's talking about, right? It's when you manifest that tribalism in a way that's exclusionary, that's where the problem is, I think. Now, I mean, unless I'm misunderstanding what your class was about, Pastor Lynn, I don't think we should just stamp out tribalism altogether.
It depends on how you define that term. There's this guy called Jonathan Haidt. It's on his class. And he he's on YouTube and things like that. I find him at least I saw one YouTube from him yesterday, which he defined tribalism more in your terms, which I don't agree with. My mind is more according to the slides we're on. He said tribalism, the term, this is just a matter of definition. It's like, if you can't help but have groups. So groups like that you feel you belong to. But where it comes back is exactly where it goes back is exactly what you said and what you said. It's like, why did the MLK movement, Martin Luther King was fighting for civil rights, right? Why did it work, he said? Because it was more inclusive than the movement today. The movement today wants to exclude the other and blame the other. In his time, during the MLK movement, it didn't work that way. That's why it worked, because he was more inclusive. So it goes to your point about exclusiveness and inclusiveness versus inclusiveness.
I don't know if we can reduce the civil rights movement to an inclusion versus exclusion paradigm, right? Because the civil rights movement wasn't, like a monolithic thing. There were multiple strategies going on inside. From my experience organizing Black Lives Matter, they've been fairly inclusive, right? The exclusion that I'm seeing is when people say, well, why am I not included in this movement? I want to be in the spotlight, right? So this is where I see backlash in, white lives matter. I don't think anybody contested whether, white lives matter, right? It's like, like these people, of course, are human, they have dignity, but if that same thing is being denied to those people, and then like other people feel as if something is being taken away from them because these tribal groups are asserting their identity. I think there's something wrong, right? I think it is like the victimhood thing, like I can only be important if I am a victim, right? So I think it's a little bit more complex than MLK being inclusive, because they did kill him, right? He did get shot. So I don't know how much inclusion worked for him. But I think there are like multiple strategies going into these movements that are a little bit more diverse than like whether people are included or excluded, right? It depends on who is being excluded, who feels excluded, who's included, who is working to be included, right? I didn't mean to, say that you're wrong, but
I think maybe the term inclusive, the way I interpreted that when I heard that, and then I heard also the exclusive, is that if you start beating up on the other group, use that term, you'll get pushed out. That's all I have to say about that.
sure, I agree with that.
I think this conversation is reflecting the fact that you can have pros and cons on either side. And I don't think today's message or the series is about going through the merits of any particular quote unquote tribe. I think the message is basically how do we, preach the gospel, recognizing that these tribes exist. Because if we go down the road of the pros and cons of each group, it's going to be a mire. You're not going to get out of that issue.
Well, I think that's where the definition of tolerance from the past and the now that makes the division.
Yes.
So I think and I feel that the way I was brought up is the tolerance from the past. It's like I respect whatever you are. I see your point of view and nothing wrong with your point. But if you push back what my point of view is, then you're causing it. So it's just a matter of, I think, each individual and what individualism is.
And you're right. I think the seismic shift, to use the term
Correctly, thank you.
is the change in the definition of tolerance. We cannot accept all the different tribes because that's a contradiction. You can't accept both sides. But we just recognize they exist and try our best to spread the gospel in that context.
And each of them, we respect the dignity of their dignity, whatever they are, and as well as they have to respect ours.
I think we have to also be
careful that we don't make Christians a tribe too, because I think that's where a lot of Christians are like, no, fighting back and saying, oh, you're persecuting us because we can't say what we want to say, and making Christianity just one more tribe.
Yeah.
And we can't fall into that kind of thing there. So I think that's something we're very conscious of.
I think that's the hardest thing to do.
Yeah.
We just had in the Cornell session, something about the, can't be holier than thou, not to be too judgmental. That's the hardest thing. I have trouble with it myself. As Grace would know.
Well, that's what I mentioned. We cannot change people.
I mean,